What becomes clear when you connect these movements is that Russia is not operating on the margins of this conflict, but inside its core economic mechanics. Every major shift in the oil market created by the Iran-US confrontation is being met by a corresponding Russian adjustment that captures value without direct military involvement. As global oil prices surged past $100 per barrel, the expectation in Washington was that Iran would feel the most immediate economic pressure. But the reality is more complex. Higher prices did increase global stress, yet they also created an unexpected revenue surge for Russia. Every sustained period of elevated pricing added millions of dollars per day to Russian export income. Instead of being economically isolated due to Western sanctions, Russia found itself in a position where global instability was increasing the value of its exports. At the same time, regulatory shifts in Western policy, introduced quietly and without major public framing, made Russian crude easier to redirect into global markets. In practice, this meant that while sanctions remained politically in place, enforcement flexibility increased due to global supply concerns. The intention was to stabilize energy markets during the Hormuz crisis, but the side effect was expanded Russian access to buyers who needed immediate alternatives. This is the first pillar of Russia's strategy: monetizing instability. The more disrupted the global energy system becomes, the more valuable Russian supply becomes as a stabilizing substitute. And because Russia already has established infrastructure with China and India, it can redirect flows quickly without building new systems. The second pillar is substitution inside China's import structure. As Iranian shipments became more unpredictable due to maritime risk and enforcement pressure, Chinese refiners did not reduce consumption. Instead, they diversified sourcing. Russian crude filled part of that gap almost immediately. The numbers show a near mirror movement. Iranian imports decline, while Russian imports rise in similar volume ranges. This is not just trade diversification. It is structural replacement. Once refineries adjust to a stable supplier, even temporarily, they begin to optimize around that supplier's logistics, pricing, and delivery reliability. Over time, this reduces dependence on riskier supply routes like those passing through conflict zones. The result is subtle but important. Iran is not fully removed from the system, but its marginal importance to China decreases. That shift weakens the strategic leverage Iran holds in any negotiation over maritime routes or sanctions relief. At the same time, Russia becomes more embedded in China's long-term energy planning. The third pillar is diplomatic embedding. Lavrov's public statements in Beijing were not isolated remarks. They were synchronized with market shifts. When he spoke about replacing resource gaps and offering cooperation on equal terms, those words were backed by actual flow data showing increased exports to China. This alignment between political messaging and physical trade flow is critical. It signals that Russia is not just reacting to demand, it is shaping expectations. By publicly framing itself as a stable alternative, Russia reinforces the idea that energy security can exist independently of Middle Eastern supply routes. This is especially important in the context of the Strait of Hormuz. The entire Western pressure strategy depends on the assumption that controlling maritime choke points creates leverage over Iran. But if major consumers like China can partially bypass that choke point through overland pipelines, sanctioned shipping networks, and alternative suppliers like Russia, then the strategic value of that pressure decreases. In parallel, Iran's export system is adapting rather than collapsing. Even under intense monitoring, oil continues flowing through decentralized networks. Tankers operate with disabled tracking systems. Ship-to-ship transfers move crude across jurisdictions that are difficult to monitor in real time. Refineries in third countries process sanctioned oil and re-export refined products under different classifications. So instead of a clean disruption, what emerges is fragmentation. The global oil system does not stop. It splits into layers. Official trade, shadow trade, and substitute supply chains all operate at the same time. Russia's advantage is that it participates in the official layer while indirectly benefiting from the shadow layer as well. China sits at the center of this structure. It receives discounted Iranian oil through informal channels, stable Russian oil through long-term agreements, and maintains strategic reserves that buffer short-term shocks. This combination reduces its vulnerability to any single disruption point. Meanwhile, the United States is operating in a system where its pressure tools are not fully aligned with the actual flow of energy. Military presence in the Gulf can influence shipping risk, but it cannot fully control distributed networks that extend beyond the Strait of Hormuz. What is emerging is not a simple confrontation between two sides, but a multi-node system where influence is distributed across supply chains rather than concentrated in one region. And in that system, Russia is positioning itself as the most flexible node, able to shift between markets, political roles, and supply gaps without direct exposure to the battlefield. This is the second layer of the structure, and it leads directly into how nuclear diplomacy becomes part of the same energy system. The next layer of this system moves away from oil markets and directly into nuclear diplomacy, where Russia is quietly positioning itself inside the most sensitive negotiation space in the entire conflict. Lavrov's statement in Beijing was not limited to energy. It also included a carefully structured offer regarding Iran's nuclear materials. He stated that Iran's right to enrich uranium is legitimate and that Russia is prepared to reprocess Iran's highly enriched uranium into fuel for civilian nuclear energy use. On the surface, this sounds technical. In reality, it is a strategic entry point into the core dispute between Iran and the United States. The central issue in nuclear negotiations has always been control. The United States demands limits on enrichment capacity, arguing that it reduces the risk of weaponization. Iran rejects long-term restrictions, viewing them as a constraint on sovereignty and technological independence. This deadlock has persisted for years because neither side is willing to surrender control over the critical material itself. Russia's proposal changes the structure of that deadlock. By offering to physically hold and process Iran's enriched uranium, Russia becomes a third-party custodian. That shifts the negotiation from a direct confrontation between Washington and Tehran into a triangular arrangement where Russia holds operational control over the material in question. This matters because custody equals leverage. Whoever physically manages the nuclear material gains long-term influence over verification, compliance, and enforcement mechanisms. Even if a political agreement is reached between Iran and the United States, the technical enforcement layer would sit with Russia. From Iran's perspective, this offers a form of strategic protection. Handing material to Russia is less politically sensitive than handing it to Washington because it avoids direct dependency on a historical adversary. It allows Iran to frame any agreement as preserved sovereignty rather than capitulation. From Russia's perspective, the benefit is structural and long-term. It embeds Moscow into every future stage of Iran's nuclear program, regardless of whether tensions escalate or de-escalate. Even if a deal is signed, Russia remains inside the system as the technical gatekeeper. From the United States' perspective, however, this creates a complication. While a Russian custodial arrangement could technically reduce proliferation risk, it also removes direct American oversight from the enforcement chain. That means the United States would be dependent on a geopolitical competitor to verify compliance in a program it considers strategically critical. This is why the timing of the proposal matters as much as the proposal itself. It was introduced during active negotiations where the gap between positions is already narrow but unresolved. Iran wants shorter restrictions on enrichment. The United States wants longer or indefinite limitations. Russia enters the space by offering a solution that allows both sides to claim partial victory while transferring operational control to a third actor. At the same time, Russia is reinforcing its role through energy diplomacy. The same week this nuclear proposal was made public, Russian oil exports to China remained at extremely high levels, while Iranian exports continued flowing through indirect channels. This parallel activity matters because it demonstrates that Russia is not choosing between energy and nuclear influence. It is building both simultaneously. The combination creates a layered position. In energy markets, Russia is a substitute supplier. In nuclear diplomacy, Russia is a technical custodian. In both cases, it becomes essential without being the primary source of conflict. This is what makes the structure difficult to categorize using traditional geopolitical frameworks. Russia is not acting as a mediator in the conventional sense because it is not neutral in outcome. It benefits materially from price increases and expanded market share. But it is also not a direct participant in the military confrontation. Instead, it occupies what can be described as a functional intermediary role, embedded inside systems where control is fragmented, but influence is concentrated in technical bottlenecks. And while this is happening in nuclear negotiations, the energy system continues to adapt around it. China's import structure, Iran's export resilience, and global price volatility are all feeding into the same network of dependencies, which leads directly into the final layer, how all of this reshapes the actual effectiveness of the pressure campaign itself. This is where the structure of the entire pressure campaign begins to break away from its intended design. On paper, the strategy against Iran is straightforward. Restrict exports, increase economic pressure, force political concessions, and regain control over maritime energy routes. But in practice, every layer of that strategy is being absorbed, rerouted, or neutralized by parallel systems. The key assumption behind the pressure campaign is that Iran's economy depends on visible, controllable export channels. If those channels are disrupted, revenue collapses and political negotiation becomes unavoidable. But that assumption no longer holds in a system where trade has fragmented into overlapping legal and illegal networks. Iran's official export channels through the Strait of Hormuz have indeed been disrupted. Shipping risk has increased, insurance costs have surged, and some routes have been partially blocked or rerouted. However, this has not eliminated exports. Instead, it has pushed them into less visible systems. Oil continues moving through ship-to-ship transfers in international waters where cargo is transferred between vessels outside territorial oversight. Tankers disable tracking systems, creating gaps in real-time monitoring. Refining hubs in third countries process crude under different labels, effectively laundering the origin of the oil before it re-enters global markets. Payment flows move through secondary banking systems outside the main Western financial network. The result is that Iran's export volume does not collapse, it disperses. The system becomes harder to measure, but not necessarily smaller. In some reported periods, Iran's exports have remained close to or even above pre-conflict levels when combining both official and shadow flows. At the same time, China's role becomes decisive. China is not simply a buyer in this system. It is the stabilizing endpoint. By purchasing Iranian crude through indirect channels and supplementing it with Russian imports, China ensures that neither supply source is fully disrupted. This dual sourcing strategy reduces vulnerability to any single geopolitical choke point. Russia reinforces that stability by increasing its supply share whenever Iranian flows become more uncertain. This creates a compensatory mechanism. When one source becomes riskier, the other expands. That prevents the kind of supply shock that the pressure campaign depends on. So instead of creating scarcity, the system creates substitution. Instead of forcing a bottleneck, it builds alternative channels. And instead of isolating Iran, it integrates Iran into a broader shadow energy network that includes multiple actors with different incentives. From a purely economic perspective, this means the pressure is redistributed rather than concentrated. Prices rise globally, which benefits exporters like Russia. Buyers adjust sourcing, which benefits China. And Iran continues receiving revenue, albeit through more complex mechanisms. This is where the unintended consequence becomes visible. The pressure campaign does generate costs, but those costs are not absorbed solely by Iran. They are shared across the system. That weakens the asymmetric impact that the strategy relies on. At the same time, military enforcement in the Gulf introduces a different layer of complexity. The deployment of carrier groups and naval assets increases risk in shipping lanes, but it does not eliminate traffic. Instead, it raises operational costs and encourages further diversification of routes. Each new restriction strengthens the incentive to bypass the visible system altogether. So what emerges is a paradox. The more pressure applied to visible infrastructure, the more energy flows move into invisible infrastructure. The more enforcement increases in one region, the more substitution grows in another. Russia's role in this dynamic is not to initiate the system, but to stabilize it. By offering large-scale alternative supply to China, Russia reduces the urgency for crisis resolution. By engaging in nuclear custodial proposals, it embeds itself into diplomatic solutions. And by expanding exports during price spikes, it converts instability into revenue. Meanwhile, China operates as a central absorber of volatility. It balances Iranian discounted crude with Russian stable supply and strategic reserves. Ensuring continuity regardless of external pressure, the United States, in contrast, remains focused on controlling a physical choke point that no longer fully defines the system's actual flow dynamics. The Strait of Hormuz is still important, but it is no longer the sole determinant of global energy movement. This mismatch between strategic focus and operational reality is what defines the current phase of the conflict. The tools being used are powerful, but they are targeting a system that has already adapted to operate around them. And that leads into the final layer. What happens when all three systems oil flows? Nuclear diplomacy and geopolitical positioning begin to converge at the same decision points simultaneously. When these three layers begin to overlap, the conflict stops behaving like a linear pressure campaign and starts functioning like a multi-system realignment. Oil flows, nuclear diplomacy, and geopolitical coordination are no longer separate arenas. They are feeding into each other in real time. At the center of this convergence is China. Not because it is actively declaring a grand strategy, but because the structure of its energy intake places it at the junction of every disruption and every substitution. China is simultaneously receiving Iranian crude through indirect maritime networks, Russian crude through stable long-term supply routes, and drawing on one of the largest strategic reserves in the world. That combination creates insulation from volatility that no other major economy currently matches. This insulation changes the logic of pressure. A pressure campaign only works if the target experiences sustained scarcity or economic instability that cannot be offset. But China's system is designed specifically to prevent that condition from forming. Every time one supply line weakens, another strengthens. Every time risk increases in one corridor, alternative flows expand elsewhere. Russia's contribution to this structure is not accidental. By scaling up exports to China, at the same moment Iranian flows become more complex, Russia is not replacing Iran in a full sense, but it is ensuring that China never faces a single point of failure. That reduces the geopolitical leverage that maritime choke points are supposed to create. At the same time, Russia's nuclear custodial proposal adds a second layer of structural stability. If Iran's nuclear material is managed through a Russian technical framework, then the enforcement mechanism of any agreement is no longer bilateral. It becomes embedded in a trilateral structure where Russia holds operational responsibility. This shifts the nature of compliance itself. Instead of direct verification between adversaries, enforcement becomes mediated through a third party with its own strategic interest. That does not eliminate tension, but it redistributes authority over outcomes. And once authority is distributed, control becomes more complex to centralize. Meanwhile, Iran continues operating inside a fragmented export environment that is no longer purely dependent on visible maritime routes. Its oil reaches markets through a combination of sanctioned shipments, shadow logistics, and indirect processing hubs. Even under sustained pressure, revenue does not disappear, it transforms. This transformation is what undermines the core expectation of the pressure strategy. The expectation is not just reduced exports, but reduced capability to sustain state functions. However, when exports continue through alternative channels, even at higher cost or lower efficiency, the economic collapse threshold is not reached. Instead, what forms is a distributed resilient system. It is not efficient in the traditional sense, but it is stable enough to prevent decisive breakdown. Russia benefits from this stability in multiple ways. Higher global prices increase revenue, expanded market share in Asia deepens long-term contracts, and diplomatic positioning inside nuclear negotiations increases its relevance beyond energy markets. Each layer reinforces the others. China benefits by securing predictable supply across multiple sources. Iran benefits by maintaining export continuity under pressure. And the United States bears the cost of sustaining enforcement across a system that is increasingly decentralized. This does not mean the pressure campaign has no effect. It increases transaction costs, raises global prices, and forces logistical adaptation. But those effects are distributed across the entire system rather than concentrated solely on Iran. That distribution is what limits strategic asymmetry. At this stage, the conflict is no longer just about Iran's nuclear program or Hormuz navigation rights. It is about who defines the structure of global energy redundancy, whether the system is controlled through choke points or through distributed supply networks that bypass choke points entirely. Russia's position inside this structure is what makes it difficult to categorize. It is not the primary initiator of the conflict, but it is embedded in every compensatory mechanism that the conflict produces. It gains from disruption, stabilizes demand in key markets, and inserts itself into diplomatic resolution pathways. And as these systems continue to interact, the distinction between pressure and adaptation becomes less clear. Because the system is no longer reacting to a single shock, it is continuously reorganizing itself around multiple simultaneous ones. Which leads into the final question. If all of this continues to stabilize rather than collapse, what does the post-conflict energy order actually look like once the pressure phase ends? That question is where the entire picture finally comes into focus. Because if this system stabilizes rather than collapses, the end state will not resemble the original intention of the pressure campaign at all. It will resemble something much closer to a restructured global energy order built around redundancy, not control. If the conflict winds down under current conditions, Russia does not return to a marginal position in global energy. It exits with expanded market share in Asia, deeper long-term contracts with China and India, and a proven ability to act as a stabilizing supplier during global shocks. That kind of positioning is not temporary. It becomes structural. Buyers who experience reliability under crisis tend to keep that supply relationship even after the crisis ends. China, meanwhile, emerges with a fundamentally stronger energy security architecture than it had before the conflict. It will have demonstrated that it can draw simultaneously from sanctioned Iranian flows, stable Russian pipelines, and internal strategic reserves. That kind of diversification reduces exposure to any single geopolitical choke point in the future. In practical terms, China becomes less sensitive to maritime pressure in the Strait of Hormuz than any previous industrial economy. Iran, even under sustained pressure, does not fully lose its export role. Instead, it becomes integrated into a parallel supply system that operates outside traditional enforcement channels. That system is less visible, more fragmented, and harder to regulate, but still functional enough to sustain state revenue. The key shift is not elimination, but normalization of shadow trade as a permanent feature of the energy landscape. The United States, on the other hand, faces a more complicated outcome. The military and economic pressure applied during the conflict demonstrates reach and capability, but it does not translate into exclusive control over energy flows. Instead, it reveals the limits of controlling a system that has already adapted to operate across multiple layers: official, semi-official, and informal. What emerges is not a clear victory or failure, but a recalibration of influence. Control over energy no longer belongs to a single choke point or enforcement mechanism. It is distributed across suppliers, intermediaries, and consumers who have learned to route around disruption. Russia's role in this final structure is what defines the long-term shift. By operating as both a substitute supplier and a diplomatic intermediary, it embeds itself into two of the most sensitive systems in global politics at the same time: energy security and nuclear governance. That dual positioning ensures relevance, regardless of whether tensions escalate or settle. More importantly, it demonstrates a new kind of strategic advantage. Not the ability to dominate a system, but the ability to remain inside every version of the system that emerges from crisis. Whether oil flows through open markets or shadow networks. Whether nuclear negotiations succeed or stall, Russia maintains a functional role in both outcomes. China benefits from that duality because it guarantees supply continuity. Iran benefits because it preserves export capability under constraint. And Russia benefits because instability itself becomes a source of structured opportunity rather than pure risk. In that sense, the real outcome of this conflict is not simply about Iran or the Strait of Hormuz or even oil prices. It is about the formation of a multi-route energy system where redundancy replaces dependence and where influence is no longer tied to controlling a single corridor. If there is a final takeaway, it is this: the system being built under pressure is not collapsing under that pressure. It is adapting to it. And the actors who understand that early are not just reacting to events, they are shaping the structure that will remain after the events end.